So this week we're going to continue with the 1980s. We're going to look at the election of 1988. So we're looking at the tail end of the 1980s, going into a couple years into the 1990s, like 1990, maybe a little into 1991. Right? Well, President Reagan is leaving office, and he has served 8 years, so he can't serve again. So the Republicans nominate George H. Bush. H. Bush was the vice president the previous 8 years for Ronald Reagan. The Democrats nominate the governor of Massachusetts. His name was Michael Dukakis. And there's a picture of Dukakis. Well, the electoral vote is over. Bush wins 426 to 111. The popular vote, he wins by about 7 million, so he's at the high end of average in 1988. There's the electoral map, again carrying most of the states that President Reagan had carried, although losing a few such as New York, which would be the big one. Well, during President Bush's term in office, the Cold War is finally going to end. It lasted about 45 years, you'll remember, starting at the end of World War II with President Truman. Well, in 1989, after a year, maybe a little bit longer, of protests and problems, there was a union in Poland known as Solidarity, led by a man named Lech Walesa. Finally, things had gotten so bad as the Soviet troops were leaving these countries, the protests grew and grew. Finally, the communist government of Poland couldn't hold them back anymore. And so in 1989, Poland holds its first free elections since before World War II. At the same time, East Germany is having the same problems. And finally, with all this pressure from its own people, East Germany opens up its borders to West Germany. And so you have a free exchange for the first time since the end of World War II, since the Nazis were in power, between East and West Germany. Right? The one thing that happens right as this starts to happen, as they open up the gates, especially in Berlin, is people start going to the wall, they're standing on it, and basically they tore the wall down by hand. Here's a picture of them holding their protest, people all over the wall. Nothing happening on the east side because they've opened the gates at this point. And like I said, they tore it down by hand. People showed up with sledgehammers and ropes and chains and all types of things and just pulled chunks of the wall down at a time. Then it only took a year, but the Germans did it faster than anybody really expected. But in 1990, East and West Germany reunified and became the Federal Republic of Germany. So with the Cold War over, there were other things going on. One thing President Carter had done was he had signed a treaty with Panama that promised that the U.S. would return the Panama Canal to Panama during the 1990s. Well, by the time President Bush is in office, Panama was ruled by a dictator named Manuel Noriega. Right? Well, President Bush didn't want to give the canal to a dictator, so on December 20th, 1989, the U.S. invaded Panama, and the purpose was to remove Manuel Noriega from power. And that's a picture of the general. There are U.S. troops in Panama, people just walking around. The invasion only took a couple of days, basically. Finally, on January 3rd, Noriega was unable to get out of the country, and with nowhere else to go, he finally surrendered to U.S. forces on January 3rd. He was brought back to the U.S. He was put on trial. He was convicted of crimes mostly around racketeering and drug trafficking, and he received a 20-year prison sentence in the U.S. He did serve most of that. Right? In 2010, he was extradited to France. They put him on trial for basically the same crimes against France, and he spent another 7 years in prison there. In 2017, he was released. He was sent back to Panama, where he, at the time, if he had been in good health, he probably would have been put on trial there. However, they just put him under house arrest because he was in bad health, and he died there. Well, shortly after that happens, during President Bush's term, Iraq invades Kuwait. Right? The leader of Iraq was Saddam Hussein. There's a picture of Hussein. He's a dictator. He'd taken over Iraq in the 1970s, and actually the U.S. had sided with him against Iran in a war during the 1980s. We sold him weapons. Well, in August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Kuwait's a small country, and Iraq always claimed that it should have been part of their country, but the British kind of just drew a line at the end of World War I. Right? So they invaded Kuwait and then annexed it, made it an official part of Iraq a few days after that. The United Nations had a vote and called for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. However, Saddam Hussein refused to do that. Afraid that he might invade Saudi Arabia, the U.S. sent in troops and put together a coalition of Middle Eastern countries and some European countries, and the job first was to protect Saudi Arabia. It was known as Operation Desert Shield. Right? After that, then they decided to remove Iraq from Kuwait with force. And so January 17th, 1991, the U.S. led a bombing campaign against Iraq, basically attacking their Air Force and other important military targets. There's a picture of Baghdad during that attack. Right? That's a night picture, and what you're seeing are tracer bullets, which light up so that gunners can see where their bullets are headed for. February 24th, the coalition forces crossed the border and started to invade Kuwait. The Iraqi army immediately started retreating, and then the coalition forces headed into Iraq. By February 27th, the Iraqi army was defeated. Right? There's a picture of a convoy destroyed by U.S. aircraft during the attack on Iraq. There's a U.S. soldier on top of a destroyed Iraqi tank, and the fires in the background, the Iraqi army actually lit oil wells on fire as they left Kuwait, and also some oil fields in southern Iraq itself. There's a group of American troops, National Guard unit. I believe they were from Alabama. Notice on the gun it says Rough Riders, which is a reference to Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War. February 28th, President Bush declared a ceasefire. Saddam Hussein was allowed to stay in power in Iraq, and basically there are a lot of sanctions, but for the rest of his life, he's kind of limited to Iraq, and Iraq is not much of a threat to the U.S. or anybody else after that point.